Today on Better Book Clubs, how to talk about books. The topic of talking about books might seem kind of self-evident to some people, but other people are intimidated by reading a book and then going to book club and having to talk about it with other people. Sometimes people just aren't really sure what they're supposed to say or how they're supposed to say it. So today I want to give you some tips on how to talk about books. And in particular, I want to refer you back to a series of videos that you'll know about if you've been following my channel that we did over the winter on a long reading of David Foster Wallace's novel, Infinite Jest. Now, you don't have to have read Infinite Jest at all in order to understand these examples that I'm going to share with you. But what you could do if you were interested in learning further is go back and watch those videos later and look for examples of the things that I'm going to talk about today and actually watch them in action as we talk about that book. My husband and I talk about it together through a sequence of 9 videos, and then the last video is a group of my husband and me and 2 other friends talking about the novel as a whole. So let's get started. My first piece of advice is to take some notes as you're reading. And I have another whole video about this. I just have a notebook that I jot down my impressions in as I'm reading. And so my notes on Infinite Jest helped me when it was time to have a conversation about it. I would go back and review my notes and pick out a couple of little things that I had written down, maybe questions I had or quotations that struck me as interesting or predictions that I wanted to test out, whatever they are. They're just my impressions. Taking notes also really helps me, at least, with my memory. So if I don't take notes as I'm reading, I tend to forget, and it makes it much harder when it's time to have a conversation and I can't even really remember very much detail about what I read. So my notebook always comes with me. Another thing to try to attain in your conversations about books is both being confident in asserting your own ideas and being open to having somebody else change your mind about something. So if you go through our Infinite Jest videos, you'll see multiple times where my husband and I are having that kind of interplay back and forth, where I'll assert something or he'll assert something and the other one will say, "Oh, really? I'm not sure about that," and maybe even push back a bit against the idea. And that's not something you should take personally. It's something that makes for interesting dynamic conversation. So watch for places where we do that and think about how that push and pull dynamic of being both confident and open to change come into play and make for a more interesting conversation. Another thing to try when you're talking about a book is to try to think like a writer, not just a reader. Think about the things that go beyond what the writer wanted you to see, the plot, the character, the themes, the dialogue, whatever it is, and think about the choices that the writer was making. I've talked about this many times before, but it's one of the things, again, that makes for a more interesting conversation. Again, that's something to watch for. When you watch the dialogue that we're having about Infinite Jest, you'll find that there are many times when we refer to the writer, David Foster Wallace, and we'll say things like, "Well, I think Wallace was trying to do this," or "I wonder why Wallace did that." So we're not just reading the book for the surface as a story. We're reading it as a work of art that was put together by a creator, and we're trying to figure out what the creator was up to behind the scenes. You'll also see that we talk a lot about themes and patterns and trying to pull the book together. We made this series of videos in the process of reading the novel for the first time because we thought it would be really fun to have a conversation as first-time readers coming to this text blind, not really knowing anything much about it or having any expectation about where it was going. What you'll see when you watch those videos is a very genuine conversation unfolding. It even was a little bit vulnerable at times because we're both professional readers in a sense. We're both English teachers, and it felt like we were putting ourselves out there a little bit, not to have studied it at all before we talked about it. But we really wanted to do it that way because it would give you a sense of what a genuine conversation looks like as it's unfolding. So you'll see us making predictions that turned out not to come to pass and trying to pull together themes and figure out what held the novel together. And because this is a particularly challenging novel in that respect, you'll see us going down lots of dead ends as we're trying that out. Even in the end, when we have a thematic conversation in our final talk with the four of us, you'll see that we didn't all see the novel the same way. One great thing to look at specifically when you're trying to do that, look at a novel thematically and kind of in the big picture, is to think about the title. And you'll also see us talking a number of times about that title, Infinite Jest. In several different videos, we come back to the title and we ask questions about, well, where does that come from? And what is David Foster Wallace trying to do? Why did he choose that title? What does he want us to be thinking about? Another thing you'll see us all doing in our conversations is bringing in outside knowledge we have. Whether it might be TV shows, which are particularly relevant to Infinite Jest, or movies, or especially other books we've read, other authors we know, or even personal experiences, we're often drawing on things outside the novel to both make sense of the novel and also think about how the novel applies to our circumstances. Because of course, that's one of the reasons we read, is to think about how what we're reading makes sense in our own larger world and helps us to see it in a new and more interesting or more meaningful way. We had a ton of fun reading the book together. My husband and I always looked forward to sitting down and making that series of videos. We're rarely reading the same book at the same time. And so even though we often talk about books because we're both readers and teachers, we don't often have that experience of reading a book at the same time, at the same pace, and reading it for the first time and pausing at particular intervals to check in with each other and see what we're thinking about it. So it was really fun for us to make that series of videos. And it also highlighted for me why we love book clubs so much, because that shared experience of reading a book and talking about it is so much fun. And it's so interesting and so fulfilling in so many ways. I really hope that even if you don't have a book club, maybe you can find one friend to share a reading with and have some conversations along the way in order to appreciate your reading of the book even more. If you like what you see here, please remember to subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.